to the next installment of The Last Word, an AALAS podcast. I'm Jennifer Smith, your host. I'm also the Director of Education and Scientific Affairs at AALAS. With me today are Alexis Skurnack and Shawn Lane, two new friends that I can't wait to introduce you to. So let me start with Alexis. Alexis is currently a Software Quality Assurance Analyst. She holds a BS degree in Agriculture and Natural Resources Ecology and Wildlife Management and is an experienced ALAT. Her research interests include ornithology, animal behavior, evolution, conservation, and wildlife management. Also with us today is Dr. Shawn Lane. Shawn serves as the Senior Clinical Veterinarian for the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center, or OUHSC, in the Division of Comparative Medicine, and he focuses on rodent clinical management and research support. Shawn has a passion for advancing research by supporting surgical and procedural methodologies and enjoys working alongside researchers to find solutions to the problems they face. He also serves OUHSC LAM Residency program as a clinical instructor. All right, Alexis and Shawn, thank you both so much for being here. I cannot wait to discuss your paper. It was recently in JLAS, and it's titled Voluntary Wheel Running as an Effective Intervention in the Management of Excessive Food Usage in CD1 Mice. All right, so Shawn and Alexis, can you guys please tell us a little bit about yourselves, your backgrounds, how you came to work together, and just a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. You want to go first, Alexis?
I'll let you go first.
Okay. So as you heard, my name's Shawn, and for the record, I apologize for that very verbose introduction you had to read for me.
Okay.
So I have spent the last 8 years, a little over 8 years at OU, working in their laboratory animal program. Initially, I came to this field because as a veterinarian in private practice, I really saw the limitations in effective welfare impact that a private practitioner can have on patient care, patient well-being. And so I kind of cast my nets a little wider, which brought me to the lab animal field. In my time here, I have noticed that rodents have a plethora of problems, and not enough has been really done to focus interventions on them. And so that's kind of what brought Alexis and I together, is identifying some of those problems they face and trying to find creative solutions. The crux of this paper was a brainchild idea of Alexis, and we kind of worked together to try and identify ways to make things better for the animals we have that make up the vast majority of our census here. In my 8 years, I've bounced around between species, but honestly, I've found the most joy working with rodents and the PIs that work with them as well. You get a lot of face-to-face interaction with rodent users, whereas some of the larger species, you don't really see those people as much. They're more in the background. And so I really like the people-to-people mindset that I get doing this. And so it really, not only this project gave me an opportunity to help the rodents, but also this will give the PIs some bit of peace of mind, if you will, that their animals are being well cared for, they don't have significant behavioral or physiologic problems, and that we have solutions that we might be able to offer when we find these potentially detrimental conditions in them. And so for the last couple of years, my focus has been there. This project gave us an opportunity to try something novel. And from what we found, which I guess we'll talk about later, it seemed to work pretty well.
Hi, I'm Alexis. As you may have noticed, my background is a bit different from the work I'm doing now. Originally, I planned to pursue field-based research, focusing on conservation studies and biological surveys. And in fact, my previous research involved studying woodpecker populations at the edge of their range. However, I eventually found my way into lab animal husbandry, where I spent 2 years. I've always enjoyed caring for animals, and this was a great learning experience for me and broadened my knowledge about animal behavior, especially with species I had originally been unfamiliar with. And it was during this time that, as Dr. Lane said, this is where we met, and I met the rest of the team for this project. And throughout this study, we were involved in every part of it, from assisting in the development of this hypothesis to managing the data collection and drafting the manuscript. And of course, the support of our co-authors along the way. They did great help in helping to finalize and refine this study.
Wow, I just absolutely loved hearing about your backgrounds. And a little pro tip there, that is my favorite part of doing a podcast, is just getting to meet new friends and amazing people. I really am excited to work with you guys today. And first, I'll just start with you, Shawn. I am so encouraged by your background. Thank you for finding your way to Lab Animal. We are so glad to have you. We need more of you. So
I'm never going back.
Yes. Oh, that makes me so happy. And Alexis, I am so glad we had you for the time that we did, but I'm so excited for everything that you are now sharing in kind of your new spin-off career. And so it's just so fascinating to see how the two of you came to Lab Animal, but then how you partnered up to have such a great impact in such a short period of time. It's really very encouraging. So thank you. All right. I want to ask you both if you could introduce us to the members of your team, because we all know that putting a paper together takes usually more than, one or two people. So we'd love to hear who worked on the paper with you.
Absolutely. Alexis, if you don't mind, I can introduce the rest of the team.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right. So our co-authors and I guess co-producers of this listed in our authorship line, Dr. Lori Garman, who helped us immensely with statistics, data analysis, determining significance, helping to refine our design in the early stages so that we were actually going to get usable functional data from it. She was absolutely pivotal to this project, getting all this information processed in a format that we could understand on the tail end of it. Miss Amy Burke, who serves as a registered veterinary technician for the Office of Animal Welfare Assurance here at OUHSC. She leads our university's training program for our PI investigators, for their PI associates, and for our own clinical and husbandry care staff here at OUHSC. Miss Burke and Dr. Madeline Buddha both helped to provide access to these animals that were on this study. So we cooperated with them and able to have access to those grinders that we needed for this. Dr. Wendy Williams is our director and AV of the Division of Comparative Medicine. She serves as general oversight and support for this. She gave us conference consultation. She helped us kind of refine our process a bit, and then just supported generally the project in its functionality and our performance of it. Dr. Madeline Buddha, in addition to serving as the director of our Office of Animal Welfare Assurance, also assisted in the final drafting of this paper, refining it a little bit to get it up to snuff for JLAS publication, and helped support it in the tail end when things got a little bit hectic, and gave us a good solid foundation to keep working on the paper.
Wow, thank you so much that was such a great introduction of the team. And I mean, it's just so obvious that you guys work so well together and respect each other and respect how much everybody adds to the team. And it definitely takes a village. So thanks again for sharing that. All right, let's jump into it, because we've been dancing around it and we want to hear about this paper. So I always start right away with the introduction, and you guys did not let me down. You did a great job of reviewing food grinding behavior in rodents, which was something that I was thinking I knew something about, but I was really happy to learn something new in reading your introduction. So could you share sort of some of that basic context with our listeners?
Yeah, sure. And honestly, I'll mirror you with that I thought I had a grasp on some of the foundational aspects of food grinding until Alexis kind of threw in some papers with some very creative and novel ideas that really makes it into this expansive problem. So as most of us know, and most listeners will probably know, rodents are basically everywhere in many forms. They're very complex creatures, but because they're so abundant in nature, we have a pretty good idea of their general physiology, their behavior, and their ability to adapt. And so no matter where you go on Earth, with the exception of Antarctica, I believe, rodents have found a way to adapt and survive. And so usually when we see behaviors, it is an adaptation to some problem. And so in the wild, we've noted, and there's multiple papers, ecological papers and wildlife papers, commenting on how mice both collect, acquire, build, and design their housing, their nests, their behaviors, how they function as a whole is pretty well understood. The problems we face are when you take them out of what would be considered the norm or the wildlife environment, you put them into a containment, like a cage in a lab facility, they start to develop behaviors that you don't really see in wild mice much because the environment is different. And so the behavior we noticed that was the foundation of this project is called food grinding, or it's colloquially called food grinding, where animals are non-productively, i.e. not ingesting food that they have removed from the hopper. They'll grind it up and turn it into small little particles, which are called orts. Sorry, Alexis, I know that's in your question, but I'm going to use the word anyway. So they create these little orts that in most cases, anecdotally, we don't appear to ever see them eat these once they're out of the food hopper. So it's become kind of a stereotypic behavior where they're doing something that doesn't seem to have a positive impact on their life. Most behaviors, when under duress, generally are an adaptation mechanism to allow an animal or a human, if you will, to survive better in their current environment. Grinding is a bit odd because it doesn't appear to us to have any true survival mechanism, doesn't seem to have any adaptation mechanism that we can really elucidate. And so there's been a lot of small projects trying to identify the causative factors to food grinding, strain-related differences. Nobody has really settled on a what causes it, but there's been a lot of hypotheses driven towards environmental factors, stress factors, etc. And so right now, prior to like the last 5 years, I think the biggest driving factor that people assumed is environmental impact from humidity. And humidity has been talked about for years as a driving force for grinding. And it really, in the day and age when most lab animal institutions have some form of environmental stabilizing ability, humidity control, temp control, we should see humidity impacting it less, and yet we still see these food grinding issues. And so it really became well, is it humidity or is it something else? And so in the wild, you can't really test this. You don't generally see it, but it probably occurs. We just don't have the evidence of it. But in the lab, it gives us that opportunity to not only have a contained field where all factors are known or are able to be known, and then we can impact that with some type of intervention that allows us to determine an effect, if you will. And so we were limited initially with our foundational information because wild mice generally don't display this behavior, and those people who do see it, we don't really understand it fully. And so we spent most of our time trying to determine, well, what could be the cause? And we got a lot of options. And one of them, I think, that carried with throughout this project that Ms. Skurnack came up with was an energy expenditure issue. And we'll talk more about that as we move on to the later questions. But, I think that as a novel concept for what's driving this behavior, it really carries some weight because it really does identify an underlying mechanism of cause and then explains the effect that we see.
Wow, that was so well put, and a great lesson for all of us. And I just love that, learning something new for sure. Okay, so what about the food grinding behavior is particularly concerning when we think about research outcomes and then also just general animal welfare? Could one of you address that?
Sure thing. So food grinding in mice can be a problem for many reasons. From a husbandry perspective, where most cages in the facility we worked in were changed out on a 3-week cycle, the overaccumulation of orts in the bedding of food grinders resulted in a weekly cage change, sometimes even daily. Husbandry would determine whether a cage needed to be changed out early on an observational basis. Excessive food crumbs cancel out the purpose of bedding, which is intended to be very absorbent and minimize odor. And this is important for suppressing the ammonia that is released from mouse urine. It also depletes the amount of space available to an animal in their enclosure and can even cause flooding if the bedding interferes with their source of water. When you work with the animals every day, habits and routines are very important, and it becomes more obvious when something such as food grinding disrupts routine and quality of life for the animals. In my experience, I was responsible for anywhere between 200 to 300 cages of mice every day, which is a lot when you are checking on them twice each day, making sure they are fed, watered, and healthy, and reporting any abnormalities we may find to our veterinarians like Dr. Lane. Adding the addition of changing out cages as much as is required for food grinders makes it very difficult to maintain quality of care, especially in facilities that may be understaffed. On top of that, the amount of food a grinder goes through is almost double or even triple the amount compared to that of a mouse with normal consumption levels. Where food in a full hopper should last a cage of mice at least 3 days, many hoppers were being depleted by day 2 or in some real severe cases within 24 hours. This can be very taxing on husbandry labor, physically and monetarily, as well as cost labs more money than they should have to spend simply because food is being wasted. While many rodents chew as a way to keep their teeth filed down, the severity that grinding mice exhibit this behavior has been considered an indicator that something may be wrong with them physiologically and with their environment. Many studies have actually linked this as a stress-related symptom, and if it is due to boredom or lack of energy outlets, like our hypothesis suggests, then therefore this obviously is not something we want to see, from an animal welfare perspective. It also may disrupt behavioral studies that depend on results that are not influenced by external stress factors, as grinding could cause behavioral research to be impacted in a negative or inaccurate light.
Oh, I really appreciate all of that, just hearing kind of that good summary of, why this really is a problem, and not just from a research kind of perspective and resources, but again, boiling down to welfare. And I really appreciate you addressing that on all different angles. Thanks. Okay, so let's jump into the study. Always like to start with the main hypothesis. What were the main hypotheses of this study?
So our hypothesis is measuring whether running wheels for enrichment purposes are an effective method for minimizing the impacts of excessive food usage, such as we see in mice grinding behaviors. While our study specifically focuses on CD1 female mice, there are other strains that have been observed exhibiting this behavior, such as JDO. I originally got this idea for the hypothesis while I had been performing my usual husbandry duties. It was well known that the mice I was responsible for had a reputation for being severe grinders. Our staff had tried everything from stuffing their nesting pucks into toilet paper rolls and providing various types of chew enrichment, and nothing seemed to be working. However, the wheels were not often tried with these particular mice because of the type of cage they were in at the time. The wheels fit a bit awkwardly and took up too much space. So we found a way to fit the wheel in where it could still function, and within a couple weeks, we noticed the grinding had virtually stopped, or at least been reduced to a degree that was not as noticeable as it was before. These cages had also plastic food hoppers, and the grinders were chewing straight through them. We found all of the food on the cage floor due to the holes they put in the hopper. This behavior stopped when the wheels were introduced as well. I had been told often that the cause of grinding was unknown and that the impacts appeared to be worse during the high humidity season. So this was kind of where we began to consider that maybe this was an energy expenditure issue, made possibly worse by the effects that humidity has on the body metabolically.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, I really appreciate hearing about how complex this problem is, and then just kind of how you took aim at solving it in several different ways in this study. So I'm excited to move through the paper here with you guys and find out more. So jumping into the study design, yours is pretty comprehensive, and we usually point our listeners, if you have the journal in front of you, you want to go to figure 2. This team does a great job of laying out this study design, and I would love for one of you to kind of just give us a basic sort of overview. It's always a good time too to define any acronyms or anything that the reader of the paper might want to know about in terms of study design.
Sure. So I'll start out by prefacing the labeling in figure 2 may be a little confusing at first glance. So just to clarify for any readers, the way this study is set up, we have an intervention or experimental group, had 13 cages total in it, and a control group. And the only difference there is one got a wheel, or one group got a wheel, the other group did not. We have a second group that's listed in figure 2B that's called a baseline group. So just for the reader's awareness, this group's only role was to give us what an average animal who's not grinding consumes across a period of time. So when we reference the terms experimental or interventional, those are synonymous. When we reference control, that is the group that was grinding but was not given a wheel. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Okay, as far as how this was designed and what figure 2 is demonstrating here, I'll preface this with, you're absolutely right that this project is complex and required a lot of design. So I have personally failed at studying food grinding for the last 5 years through multiple iterations of attempting to design projects, trying to determine, are they eating it? Are they wasting all of it? How much are they going through? And I'll tell you, after failing multiple times, I realized that I would need way more resources than are at hand and at my disposal to do this the best way possible. And so when you start talking about the complexity involved in food grinding, on the surface, you look at it and it's, they're just chewing on their stuff. That's all it is. But then you start talking about energy expenditure. Well, the best way to study energy expenditure and intake is through metabolic caging. So if you were going to go the route of really defining the in and out, the excess versus the waste versus, behaviors that are born of energy in excess, we would really need to know what that energy level is. So if we were going to have all the resources available that we possibly could, this study would look probably quite a bit different. So with what we had access to, we really needed a very fundamental way of approaching this project so we could not only track our data effectively, but we could also track what intervention actually did while excluding those factors we couldn't control. And so our facilities here, we have a wide range of facilities that both control environmental parameters and don't. The animals in this study were in an environment that was not well controlled, with the exception of temperature. That was regulated very well. Humidity, however, fluctuated with the external environmental humidity and the general building humidity. So when we get to figure 2, you can look at the top row stating intervention group. So all of the animals initially, we had essentially a room, a cohort of animals just under observation for the initiation of grinding behavior. Any animal any cage that was shown to be grinding was enrolled in our interventional group or our control group based on numbers that we had available. So we ended up with 13 total cages in our intervention group. At the beginning of the study, we started measuring the amount of food difference in the hopper over a 24-hour period of time. And so what that looks like is we would put a measured amount of food into the hopper. We would weigh the hopper and the feed. And then 24 hours later, we would come in, we would weigh the hopper and the feed, missing whatever has been eaten or ground. And then we would find the difference. We tracked that in every cage enrolled over the first 10 days of this study to get a kind of a median baseline. And then for the experimental group, we added in the running wheel. And so every cage that had food grinding and was enrolled in that interventional group was given a running wheel for 20 days. So day 11 to day 30, they had access to that wheel, whereas our control group had no running wheel. Only difference between these two groups. All cages were monitored throughout this entire 40-day period for the weight difference between the hoppers. And then in the interventional group at day 31, so after 20 days of having access to the wheel was removed, and this was to determine a true effect. So if you put it in and there is an effect, removal should have an opposite, if not equal. And so that was how we kind of designed the study so that we could contain it to a small number of animals or a small number of cages. We use them almost as controls against themselves with the removal of the wheel at the end to confirm that that effect was truly because of the wheel and not because of some unknown factor we were unable to control. And then we had a side-by-side control group who went through this on the exact same days, but never got that wheel for intervention. And so that outlines kind of what you're seeing in figure 2A. And again, 2B is just stating that for 10 days, we measured 8 cages just to get a standardized level of food consumption in a non-grinding cage. And this served as our baseline comparison for the grinding cages with the wheel, our interventional group, and the grinding cages without the wheel, our control group.
Wow, thank you for really bringing all of that to life and explaining it. And I really appreciated your comments around just sort of how in a perfect world you might design this study differently, and just that insight into this problem I think is so helpful for others. So thank you again for that. I did want to ask you a quick follow-up to this question, and that was, how did your group decide on the duration and specific measurements for monitoring food usage?
Yeah, so that's tricky in any project. So knowing how long or how much is enough is difficult when you're talking about something that hasn't really been well studied. So we worked with our statistician a bit in the beginning to design timeframes, but ultimately our hand was forced somewhat by the seasonal changes. So considering that seasonal shift, climate shift at the turn of usually it's the fall and winter, and then the spring into the summer is when we see those big changes in humidity, barometric pressure. We see changes in our climate patterns, and no matter how well you control your environment, you're going to get external environmental impact. So our statistician helped us kind of get an idea of roughly how many numbers and roughly how long, but really when we went into designing the actual study start, we were trying to get it all accomplished within one season so that we did not see that impact of the seasonal change on this behavior, trying to eliminate as many external factors as possible. With the inclusion of the back end removal of the running wheel, and the strength that would lend to our data and our conclusions, we were able to keep this to a slightly smaller sample size, albeit there was risk involved in that. If we didn't have as significant of an impact on our running wheel, significance probably wouldn't have been achieved with this many cages, and it would have probably required a larger number. The nice thing is we did, and we saw great response, which lends itself to significant conclusions from this study. And so it was a fairly short project, but using a before and after period that is equal to the total duration of intervention was one recommended by our statistician consult, but also the combination of having a side-by-side control group at the same period of time, and then having that check on their cells for the interventional group of not only intervening with the wheel and then removing the wheel. That allowed us to really confirm that that effect was truly from our wheel. And so kind of a lot of factors went into it, but we were able to accomplish this study within one singular season without seeing too much environmental impact. But we'll get a little bit more into the data as we move on to our next figures. You'll kind of see there was some tail end involvement in humidity, which actually benefited us because we were able to evaluate what those impacts were and how they impacted our animals on study.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you again for such detailed, kind of responses here. And I really appreciate hearing a shout out to your statistician. I think such a great addition to any team, having that consult. And it sounds like that person was able to really steer you guys in the right direction, especially taking into account the environmental, potential variables. And I really love the robustness of this study for that. All right, so let's talk about the mice. You guys chose CD1 mice, and I know you talked maybe a little bit in the intro about those mice and about some of the known behavior of the food grinding, but I'd love to know sort of if you feel like you would have gotten some similar results with a different strain, or would it have been different?
Yeah, so CD1 mice, as we mentioned, were the mice that I happened to be working with at the time that had a reputation for grinding, at least in our facility. Because we had seen results in the incidental observation of them, we wanted to expand the study further to actually quantify what we had been seeing. Aside from this, they were the only obvious grinders in our facility aside from JDO, which were not under my care nor as feasible to study at the time. And when I say obvious grinders, I mean mice that exhibit grinding to such a degree that it actually disrupts normal husbandry care routine and can clearly be seen when looking at the bottom of the cage floor. CD1 mice were readily available as they were easily able to be provided from Dr. Buddha and her research team, and we're grateful that she let us borrow them for this behavior study. Overall, I do think we would see similar results in other strains. In fact, when we did this, we tested out the wheels on the JDO mice in our facility, and they were known to be even worse than our CD1s, as they were going through all of their food in one day and requiring daily changeouts. While still severe comparatively, their changeouts became less frequent, only weekly instead of daily, as they were not grinding their food as fast. And while they were not quantified for this study, this is one strain that we would have liked to measure as well had given the chance. I do think that this wheel intervention could work on any strain struggling with grinding behaviors. However, if this is related to energy expenditure and is a deeper metabolic issue, then the level of effectiveness may vary, especially if the differences in strain are metabolic related. This is also why I think we saw grinding behaviors in specific strains of mice rather than random individuals across hundreds of cages.
Oh, Excellent. Yeah, I really like your approach to that question. You guys are pros at this, by the way. All right, I do want to ask you a follow up, and I ask this question a lot. So it's not just you guys. When I see a single sex study, our readers are always going to ask, kind of, why only females in this study? Could you have used males? If you had used males, do you think there would be a sex predilection for grinding or not? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we actually chose the sex of the mice for similar reasons that we chose the strain. They were readily available and were the ones we noticed in the pilot observation. In captivity, it is often recommended that mice are housed in groups due to their social nature. However, males commonly experience separation, and lower housing numbers as group-housed males often lead to individual harm and infighting due to their aggression and territorial tendencies. While energy expenditure sounds specific on the surface, like Dr. Lane said, it encompasses many factors, and space being just one of them. For every additional mouse in a cage, that is territory and space that cannot be used as effectively for mice that need an outlet for potential pent-up energy. It is difficult to say whether similar results would show for male mice in the same settings as the females we studied, especially as females are the primary subject in our facility. If I were to guess, we might expect to see less frequency in grinding of males, or even none at all, as males might lean toward expending their energy in other ways. While both males and females can build nests, mate, play with other mice, and be territorial, it has been observed that males fight more over territory than females when group housed. Additionally, as females have a more drastic fluctuation of hormones due to their ability to reproduce, it could be possible that their maternal or social instincts might influence their behavior during periods of higher temperatures and humidity when they would normally breed, even if not pregnant. While lab mice are under a more controlled environment than wild mice, behaviors relating to energy expenditure, such as conserving energy in colder seasons and expending more of it in warmer seasons, might still present itself, especially in places that cannot control relative humidity. Of course, this is just my perspective. I have limited knowledge personally on these finer details metabolically, and this is just where more studies would be necessary to get a true understanding of the difference between male and female mice in this area.
Yeah, thank you for that. Again, very detailed answer.
And now it's time for a short break.
Ready to boost your team's skills in lab animal science? Discover the AALAS Learning Library. Train all your staff in one place, from investigators to managers, and earn AALAS, CEUs, and RACE CEs with discounts for groups. Sign up for free to access select courses instantly and explore valuable resources to enhance your team's expertise. Elevate your learning with AALAS Learning Library. AALAS is now on all your favorite social platforms. If you want to be in the know around upcoming deadlines, highlights from this month's journals, or even just fun holidays, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram today.
All right. So our listeners, I know, love to hear about any kind of specialized equipment that is used in these studies, especially when it's somebody doing something sort of creative that hasn't been done before, or, a new twist. So we would love to know more about the running wheel. I think it's called the Inno wheel. We'd love to know a little bit more about it. And you mentioned already that you had some unique way to put it into the cage for this study, and we'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, sure. So first and foremost, I am not a paid representative of Innovive, nor do I get any type of kickback for that.
Me neither.
So one of the big things I love about working here is we really have a good desire to engage in the most up-to-date and the most effective enrichment devices we can find or make. We do a lot of creative self-creation, if you will. And so we've used the Inno wheel, for years now, probably more than 5, less than 9, being my guess. And the nice thing about the Inno wheel and the Inno dome, which is kind of a 2-piece set, is that it is fairly compact. It has got a fairly low profile. Whereas you see some other running wheels that are marketed out there, they're either a side mount to the cage, and they take up a sizable chunk of the square inches of the floor. They'll hang from the wire bars of the feed hopper. This one is an independent. It can come and go from any cage type. The only downside to it is that the wheel is positioned on an angle on top of the dome. And so the dome is about a 2.5-inch tall igloo-shaped hut with multiple entry and access points. And then the wheel kind of plugs into a little seating peg on the top of it, canted at about a 45-degree angle. So that gives the animal somewhere that they can get on top, and then the wheel will freely spin. And so it's a really creative design on a running wheel. Most of us, when we think of, a wheel in a rodent cage, you think of the hamster running on the wheel that everybody's brain just turned to. And it's a vertical wheel. And so the animal gets into it on the side and it runs. It's completely flat the whole time, whereas this one is canted, and I think it offers more usability across multiple cages. Alexis had referred to some difficulty with the cage type initially with these, and so cages that have a more centralized hopper or food basket can sometimes get in the way of that angled wheel. And so we found it really works well when there's more of a back end of the cage placement for the hopper. So just thinking of some of the caging modalities out there, if you take up the middle of the room, it's hard to fit something in there. But if you take up the back of the room, then the whole front is available for you to use. And so we found it to be usable in most of our cages. It just takes a little bit of creative positioning, and they are prone, if the mice move it a little, it might stop the wheel and prevent it from running. But we use them as often as possible. We use them not only as primary housing structures for new litters or new pups, or just generally any group of mice, but the running wheel is kind of our interventional prospect. So if they already have the dome and we see a behavioral issue, you can just pop the wheel on real quick, and it takes about 5 seconds, and they're good to go. And I will tell you, there's nothing quite like walking into a room of mice just going hard on their running wheels and just hearing that noise. It's been like, they like it. They really like it. And so it was nice that we could use something like this that our enrichment team has really pushed as a good option for enrichment for rodents. And the fact that our response to this enrichment item that seemed just like this benign hut and running wheel, the fact that we saw the response we did is absolutely remarkable on something that we just passed off as, oh, it's just another house. Well, this one's got a little more to it, and we definitely had some good results because of it.
Okay, Shawn, thank you for that excellent answer. I love hearing about that, and the visual, in my head now is walking into a room with, 500 mice on running wheels. So thanks for putting that in my head. But I really appreciate that. And shout out to your—
You're very welcome.
Yeah, shout out to your institution for, obviously it sounds like putting the animals' needs first and being willing to be creative, to make new things and or purchase items that are helpful. So I love hearing that. All right, well, let's talk about these results because you got a lot of them. So I think if we're following along in the paper, figures 3 to 6 show your results. Really, really beautiful there. And we would love for you guys to just kind of share some of the highlights for our listeners.
Okay, so I will talk about figure 3 first. Figure 3, graph A, is comparing our experimental group of grinding mice against the intervention of the running wheel. For clarity purposes, the experimental group is labeled intervention group on the graph. These terms are used synonymously to refer to the group of mice given a running wheel. Graph B is comparing our control group of grinding mice against the lack of intervention of a running wheel. In other words, our control group did not get a wheel. Red on both graphs indicate a period of grinding without a running wheel. Blue on graph A is the period where the running wheel was introduced for the grinders. While our control group of grinding mice did not receive a running wheel during this period, we still marked this blue on graph B so the reader is aware that these are the same time frames. We did not have this control group to specifically compare against the experimental group. I just want to reiterate that. We knew that our facility did not have the means to regulate humidity and that it would likely interfere with our results. So while not included in the main hypothesis, this was our way of accounting for humidity. If higher humidity increased grinding during the blue periods in grinding mice that did not get a wheel, then we could better accurately interpret if humidity would have an effect on the mice that did get a wheel during this period. If you notice the varying levels of grinding prior to wheel placement in days 1 through 10, where cages are going through hundreds of grams of food, we actually start to see an even higher increase in grinding around the 8th day. For our experimental group, graph A shows an immediate drop at day 11 when the running wheel is introduced and maintains this baseline average, all cages reduced to less than 100 grams of food usage for majority of the time period up until day 30, when the grinding spikes again before tapering off. While the control group depicted in graph B was a small number, the limited data we have here shows less stability during the intervention phase of the experimental group. Graph A for our experimental group shows periods of instability during the red periods when the running wheel was not introduced, following by a stable period when the running wheel was introduced, whereas our control group shows a pattern of instability during all periods when they were without the running wheel.
All right, now move on to figure 4. So this is when things get a little complicated. Me as a fairly novice researcher, the graphs like these are the ones that always makes my eyes bulge. So figure A, when looking at it, it looks like a lot, but this is a normalization graph. Just it uses the baseline values we got from our 8 baseline cages, not to be confused with control, and it assigned the value of 1 to that number for our baseline to reflect what our food usage would look like for that intervention group. And so you can see the range in numbers, and recall each of these data points is taking the median of 13 total cages. And so you can see those values kind of trend a little bit all over the place in that day 1 through day 10. And then again, you get a little bit of that, but not to such a severe degree in day 31 through day 40. But what's really captured here is in all of those blue data points, we are seeing that the food usage is below that assigned normalization value of 1 for almost the entirety of the point when the wheel is present in the cage. We do have some that trend upwards. We had some outliers who had a bad day, or maybe they had some excess energy because they binge ate the night before. But for the most part, you can see a very drastic normalization of the usage when that wheel is there. And we went from having these wide ranges, day 10 ranged from 50% to 800% of what the normalized value was, whereas we don't have anything exceeding about 350% of that normalized value once the wheel is present. And so that's a really good way of looking at, okay, well, as a total, what is this actually showing us? And then in figure 4B, you can see that kind of reflected in another way. This time it's the actual change in the food used. So that difference from full hopper to 24 hours later mapped across the days and the data points that we collected. So our first day, that was honestly, I think that data point is most likely because we didn't have a baseline value for day 1. But you can see there was a really weird arrangement and portrayal of that food usage across those first 10 days, where you'd see some in excess of what our normal was. Some were pretty close to it, and then initially you saw they were low, but once that wheel gets placed at day 11, nearly every data point is utilizing less food in a day than when the wheel is absent. And this graph really reflects what we thought we were going to see and what we were happy to see on the tail end, is that placement of that wheel reduced total food usage in those cages almost consistently throughout. And you can see our key icons here, which reflect different significance values for different measurements that were taken. But ultimately, this is a good visual representation of it. Placement of that running wheel will see a reduction in total food used in that cage over a 24-hour period.
Great. So I would love to hear kind of your take on why do you think these, what are the physiologic reasons, I guess I should say, behind this behavioral change, right? So you put the wheel in, and then we're seeing this change of reduction of food usage.
Right. And you don't really get much from it if you just consider the surface view of that. Like, we put a wheel, they stopped grinding. That's a very easy one-to-one correlation. And what we were seeing is that within probably 10 minutes of a wheel being placed in the cage, they were actively using it. Mm-hmm. And they were actively using it almost consistently throughout the day periods when we'd be observing them. And Alexis could probably attest to that more often, how many times she walked into that room and just heard them going to town on their wheels.
Right. Yes.
But what we saw there is we saw these animals occupying their time more with this wheel. And this gets us back to the energy expenditure prospect, is that, we now have given them an outlet for that energy, for that, we in the beginning, we were talking about boredom as one of the ways we could consider this. And it's not truly boredom, but if you have something to do, you're not thinking about food. And that goes for humans too. Like if you're occupied in something, you're not thinking about snacking generally.
Well, I don't know.
Okay, not all of us. But the more occupied you are, we can generally conclude that you will be less likely to be thinking about food. You will be less likely to look for creative outlets for your energy. And so we gave them a very functional, practical thing for them to occupy their time with. And that is what we saw. And so we saw our wheel not only, at this point, we were surmising energy expenditure and occupational enrichment are the big takeaways from this wheel. Mm-hmm. But considering also that these animals physiologically, if they're engaged in active behavior, they're, the fight or flight, rest or digest, their GI system's probably not engaged too much. And so if there is an underlying mechanism of some type of hunger or some type of food associated trigger, occupying them with some type of occupational enrichment is going to reduce the likelihood that that trigger is going to be acted upon, if you will. And ultimately, I think this all ties back to energy expenditure because the body is going to tell that animal there is something about food that it needs to pay attention to. But if you give them something to do, the body's less likely to send them that trigger, and the animal is less likely to stop what it's doing and go look for a creative solution to that problem.
Excellent. So let's talk about this then. What happens when you take the running wheel away?
So in figure 4, at least, and Alexis, jump in anytime you want on this, but figure 4, you can see that on day 31, we're pretty similar to what we saw on day 30, and this is figure 4A. We're pretty similar to what we see on day 31 and 30. And then as you go, you start to see those ranges and those median values across the cages getting wider and wider and wider. And so we start to surmise that removal of that has no longer given them that opportunity for energy expenditure and occupation. And so we are going back to, well, what do we have available? We have food. Let's grind our food. And so figure 4B demonstrates that in much better visual, in my opinion. And you can just see that within 2 days of removing the wheel, we start to see an increase in that food grinding behavior. Not a huge one. And across the board from day 31 to day 40, we see less variation in our range of food usage, but it is still going to be trending higher than what we saw when the wheel was placed. Now, there is some potential there for environmental factors. As I mentioned before, we did see a shift in our humidity towards the tail end of this project. We can discuss that a little bit more when we get to figure 6. But at this point, from this graph, you can make the conclusion that removal of that wheel at day 31 preceded the increase in food usage, at least the median ranges as reported in figure 4A.
So as Dr. Lane said, you can definitely see there's big shifts between how the mice respond with and without the running wheel. And we actually had another graph that did not make it into our final paper that was outlined similar to figure 3, but it included a line that showed the average consumption level of non-grinding mice and also had humidity levels charted along with it. Our humidity data charted in this way showed more clearly how grinding levels fluctuate in line with humidity as it fluctuated. And so the perceived rebound effect we mentioned in our paper, we believe to be in consistency with this. And the humidity levels we were seeing at the time when the wheels were taken away, humidity was at its highest, around 50 to 60%. As October came along and humidity dropped to 10 to 15% humidity, this is where we see grinding levels drop drastically on its own without the running wheel for our experimental group.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for adding that. So I guess just sort of as a follow-up to that then, the importance of humidity control in research facilities. I mean, obviously we know it's important. And I'm just now kind of wondering, how much attention should we be spending on that to curb something like food grinding or frankly, other behaviors that could be, similar.
Right.
Thoughts on that?
That's a loaded question right there. I did a short stint as a facility manager here back in my youth. I'm only 36, but I spent some time there, and I have been through the frustrations of trying to manage the environment for research animals. And from that, I'll tell you, good luck. Doing it effectively, consistently, and to a degree that essentially removes environmental impact from our animals is nearly impossible. It's doable, but the resources you'd need to have on hand in order to put in the time, energy, and technology that you would need is probably beyond most institutions. That said, I'm an idealist at heart, and if you truly want to study a research problem using animals, and you want those animals to give you the best data possible, you need to control as many factors that are influencing that animal and that data as possible. And so when it comes to rodents, I mean, essentially most of our research studies on rodents are going to be collecting any number of samples. And humidity is going to have an impact on the physiology, the metabolics, and just the behavior of any animal that experiences fluctuations in it. So in an ideal world, it would be excellent to be able to control every aspect of the environment that animal is in so that you have better confidence in your data. The reality is that is unlikely to be achieved by most institutions and most researchers, just due to the complex and monumental obstacles that they would face doing that. You would ideally need to be set up in a place that doesn't see normal or heavy fluctuations in humidity. Good luck finding those. There's only a few on the planet. You would need the best technology to make sure your environment is isolated from the outside world. And you would need to have quality control, probably in triplicate, to ensure no failing to your systems. And I just feel that, while it would be the best case scenario, it's unlikely to be achieved. And to some level, we have to expect there's external factors influencing our work. And this might be one that we all just accept that it's going to impact. We don't fully know the full extent of how, but we do know there's an impact on food grinding behavior.
Sure. All right. So I'm going to ask you another loaded question, since you guys are experts.
Tag, Alexis, you're it.
Yeah. What is most important if you want to manage known food grinding? The humidity or the running wheel?
Ooh.
Yeah. So as Dr. Lane said, it's definitely really difficult to manage for humidity, I think. And so in my opinion, the data shows it here that it's possible that a running wheel would be a better treatment method for grinding than simply low humidity alone. Not only is it difficult to manage low humidity, but it's just better that you can give the animal something that will help benefit them. If you recall the figure I mentioned that we did not get to include here, and you can also see it in figure 3, during the periods the wheel was introduced and humidity was at its highest, grinding levels were reported lower for our experimental group in some instances than we saw at the end of the study when the humidity had dropped and no wheels were present for the same group. I think to get a real accurate depiction of this, it would be best to replicate the study year-round, keeping as many variables the same as possible, see how seasonal shift during its highest and lowest periods could impact the grinding. But as I mentioned before, if this is indeed due to an energy expenditure issue, then whether or not the wheel is more effective at treating mice with this behavior over low humidity might also be answered through the metabolic data of different mouse strains or sexes. There are a lot of metabolic studies in animal research, but I'm not sure if any of them have ever compared strains in this way, especially as it pertains to humidity and energy expenditure. And this would be something worth looking into. In general, though, where possible, I think it's always better to provide animals with enrichment if we can. If the difference between the impact of low humidity versus adding a running wheel is minimal, then I would choose the running wheel. It's important to me that even animals in research are cared for to a standard that keeps them happy and healthy, and something as simple as a running wheel, if it enriches their lives, is worth it.
I love that answer. Thank you. Sorry about that loaded question, but I couldn't help myself.
I mean, if I can chime in with one more little adage, if you will. I mean, yes. regardless of which one is the most important to control, you should always have in your back pocket an effective intervention when faced with that. And so what I like to view this as is we have effectively shown that humidity control might be an intervention, but barring that ability, the running wheel is also a good intervention. And so if you're limited in your ability to control that environmental enrichment or that environmental, those factors, then the running wheel serves as an effective intervention in that case. If you have the capacity to adjust your humidity, it may also serve as a potential intervention. But from our study, we can support that a running wheel is an effective intervention. We do not have enough data to support just the concept that humidity adjustment will intervene in the same, better or less effect, just to clarify.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, that clarification for sure. All right, we are getting to the end of our time, which is such a bummer because this is so fun. I'm working with you guys. All right, I have a couple more questions. Let's see if we can get through these. Let's see, I know your discussion does a really nice job of bringing up some limitations to the study, and I always praise our authors who do that because it's important. We all have limitations based on where we're working, time of year, seasonality, what you have access to, on and on. So I'd love to hear a little bit. We already talked a little bit about seasonality. We talked about the sex, the strain. I would love to hear a little bit more about the smaller sample size, and then if you could quickly address the single versus group housed as well, potentially if that impacted the study.
Yeah, sure thing. So increasing sample size and including mice of similar grinding rates for a control group is something we considered would be more helpful to make these results clear. I think Dr. Lane mentioned that earlier and explained that very well. It's something we might recommend for further studies like this in the future. While having that control group really wasn't necessarily required for us to get the results we were looking for, it was good practice to account for the factors we could not control. I think having single versus grouped house mice would yield different results, at least when comparing males versus females. One also has to consider individual variability as well. When mice housed together exhibit grinding, it is unknown whether that behavior is a product of all individuals or just one mouse that is stressed out by the others they are housed with, which is not something that we studied here. While one could recreate the study and house a group of males together or single females by themselves, I'm not sure if it would be as useful to the field in terms of treatment, as some situations are unlikely to be realistic in a lab setting or just difficult to maintain. So one also has to consider when doing studies like this, and for the purpose of the research with this topic is, whatever results you get, what is the impact? What does it change? I think it's important to not get too lost in all the different scenarios that can play out and focus on the goal and why it's important we study the factors that we choose. And so it's very important that we consider all of these other things, but at the end of the day, also, if it makes sense for the facilities that we're working in.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And again, kudos to you guys for laying that out there. Was something else I think we hit on earlier, and I also read in your discussion that I just wanted to ask about was measuring or potentially measuring rather ORT production as well as actual individual mouse activity on the wheel. Were those things that potentially you thought about including, or were those things that would just really have made this paper something even more beastly to tackle?
So if you remember my mentioned failures of the past, so one of the projects I had designed a couple of years ago was trying to determine the volume and measurement of ORT production in cages to try and determine how much food they're actually ingesting or wasting. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you this much: if you do not have metabolic caging, don't do it. Don't try, because you will have to sift through cage nesting material, bedding material to try and identify an ORT. So then you have to define how big is an ORT to make it an ORT. Then you have to sift through them. You have to find out what is food versus poop versus just general cage debris. And the amount of hours of labor that would include would make it exceptionally difficult to pull off. Now, that said, I was attempting to do this across 20 cages, and that was probably more than I should have bit off. But I will elaborate that something that this study would benefit from is evaluating and determining how much energy they use as they are engaged in that running wheel. And so if we were going to dive into this further, then the next steps would be determining energy intake, determining energy output, and determining how much of that food is actually going towards nutrition and energy of the animal's body. And so running time on the wheel would be exceptional to get if you had that background data. Else it's just how much time did they spend on the wheel? Cool. How much time did they spend grinding their food? And that doesn't have a whole lot of significance to it other than maybe supporting the, well, they were engaged in a behavior which kept them from grinding argument. And so if we were going to measure that, we would really need to have all those specifics as to the nutritional content of the orts, how many calories are missing, how many are they actually ingesting, getting a sense for what their output levels are versus their intake levels and what is lost in between. And so, yes, absolutely, it would be ideal to have a comprehensive study that includes all of that. And I will say that I tried doing that, but we really, considering the paucity of data out there exploring the impacts and the factors influencing food grinding, we really needed to start with a pretty basic idea, get the data for that, and then we can use that to elaborate and build upon for future projects. And so this, on the surface, honestly, it doesn't even look on the surface anymore to be a simple prospect. This study was initially a simple idea that we were able to get really useful data from. But in the end, long term, if people continue to study this, I fully expect there will be metabolic studies on food grinding and energy expenditure. There will be equations probably for determining amount of time spent on a wheel to calories expended, and we'll be able to figure all that out. But right now, we did not have the resource capacity to be able to pursue all of those specific data points. But I would love to see that information published.
Yeah, me too. And hopefully with your name on it. I really, I appreciate that you guys, took a very simple idea, like you said, and really put it to task. And of course that you shared it with JLAS and here on the podcast with the rest of the community. We need more of you doing this very type of thing. So thank you again. All right, we are done. I am at the last question of time I can ask. I ask the same type of question to all of our guests. And for you guys, your question is going to be, what type of advice would you give to somebody who is either a researcher or working in an animal facility, designing a program, where they have a behavior such as food grinding, and they really need to figure out the best way to address it from a data collection and a welfare sort of standpoint? What kind of advice would you give to someone like that?
Yeah, sure. I can go first. So I have, I'm not a unique perspective as a veterinarian in lab animal. There's a lot of us, but I have a unique brain, if you will. So ultimately, the best advice I can give is collaborate. Communication is always going to be the best way to find a solution to any problem you face. I think the biggest issue that we face, from my perspective as a veterinarian or in general as the caretakers of these animals, is when research aims and care aims interact in a way that doesn't provide an easy path forward mutually. And so if a research study prohibits the use of occupational enrichment, for example, that would be something where, okay, well, the science is making it so we can't intervene in this case, and the welfare of these animals can't be improved upon with a running wheel. And so what I found to be the best is just have a conversation. Like if you identify a problem, but you see obstacles in front of you, if those obstacles are a result of, a person or a party or a group, have a conversation, explain what you see, what you hope to achieve as a result of whatever intervention you propose, and then work with them to find a solution forward. We have to be very creative in this field. It is not easy, like in private practice, to give you that example. You generally know what you're doing. You have a prescription, you have a path you can take, and your biggest argument you'll get from your clientele in that setting is financial. It's not always the biggest argument we get in our field. It's usually, oh, that'll interfere with my data. And so finding collaborative means to address problems from the veterinary and the care side is going to be the best way forward. You cannot steamroll through researchers and just tell them this is how it's going to be, and you can't let them steamroll through you, or you're going to end up with poor welfare across the board. So the best thing I could advise is just talk. Like it doesn't have to be a one person versus another. The best way forward is always going to be via collaboration.
Yeah, so first off, I want to thank you so much, Jennifer, for having us. We are so grateful for this opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Lane, for being here with me as well and providing
Thank you all.
your definitely unique perspective. To add to Dr. Lane's comments, my final advice would be that it's essential to approach challenges in animal science with both creativity and intention. Whether one's focus is more on animal care or research, we can't cut corners or show indifference. It not only undermines our field, but also hinders meaningful progress. While compromise is inevitable, our aim should be to confidently pursue solutions that reflect our commitment to excellence and to maintain a high-quality standard of work. As Dr. Lane noted, open communication and collaboration between researchers and animal care staff are invaluable. By understanding each other's goals, we can be more effective and address complex situational challenges on a case-by-case basis and uphold the integrity of our work.
Wow. Well, Alexis and Shawn, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, I found your answers and just your outlook on research and welfare and that collaboration to be just so refreshing and something that is just, we need to keep talking more and more about this. This is the path forward. And I so appreciate that you guys were able to really articulate that so well. I am very thankful that you both found your way to Lab Animal, and more than anything, thank you that you took this idea and ran with it and shared it with us. So thank you. All right. For anyone else who is listening, we invite you to subscribe and leave us your comments and questions in the section below. We also invite you to consider submitting your current or future research to JLAS. You can also always follow us on our socials or email us at info@alas.org. We do want to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear what you think about this episode. And finally, to everyone, thank you from the ALAS team for listening to The Last Word.